In a cardboard box that had sat untouched for years, a daughter found her father's secret. Pencil on sheets of toilet paper, a diary he had kept as a prisoner of war, one he had never once mentioned, not in 70 years. His name was Louis Pape, a farm boy from Illinois who became a P-38 Lightning pilot in the U.S. Army Air Corps. And for decades, the war he fought was something he simply did not talk about. The way an entire generation of veterans came home, put their uniforms away, and got back to the business of living, leaving the worst of it unspoken. It started on a visit to the family farm in the late 1970s. His daughter, Cheryl, and her husband, David Denslow, had come to see her parents. That day, Louis brought out an old cardboard box, one of the Red Cross parcels sent to Allied prisoners during the war, packed with powdered milk, cigarettes, canned meat. Most prisoners ate the contents and kept the empty tins, useful little pieces of metal in a place where nothing was wasted. Louis had used his for something else entirely. He had turned it into the cover of a book. He showed them a few items from inside. Then he quietly put the box away. "I was humbled by some of the stories he told," David would later say. "Cheryl told me I should feel privileged. She had never seen some of those items herself." When Cheryl's mother passed away in 2013, the box came to them. For years, it stayed closed. Then, in 2024, on a cruise that happened to stop in Norway, David struck up a conversation at a war museum with a woman whose father had also been held at Stalag Luft III, the very camp where Louis had spent 20 months of his life. That chance encounter changed everything. "When we got home, I told Cheryl, I want to go through the box again," David said. He built a small stand out of scrap wood, propped up his phone, and began photographing every page of pencil marks on toilet paper, faded by 80 years. He enlarged each image on a screen just to make out the handwriting. "It was slow work," he said, "but I didn't want to miss anything." What they found, page by page, was the record of a young man's war, written in the only material he had. To understand what Louis Pape was writing about, go back to September 2, 1943. The Allies had just invaded mainland Italy at Salerno, and the 12th Air Force was flying constantly over the battle. The P-38 Lightning was the only fighter in the Mediterranean theater, with the range to escort medium bombers deep into enemy territory and bring them home again. And that day, Pape was flying one, escorting B-25s of the 321st Bombardment Group on a mission to hit the rail yards at Cancello, just northeast of Naples. The P-38 itself was a strange-looking machine to the men who faced it: twin engines, twin-tail booms, a central pod for the pilot. German pilots had a nickname for it: Der Gabelschwanzteufel, the fork-tailed devil. It carried 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20-millimeter cannon, all clustered in the nose, giving it a concentrated punch other American fighters of the time couldn't match. On this mission, it was doing what it did best, staying with the bombers all the way to the target and back, farther than any single-engine escort of the era could manage. More than 200 German fighters rose to meet the formation. Pape shot down 2 of them. Then his own Lightning took hits from the enemy and from friendly fire in the chaos of the dogfight. He lost both engines. The aircraft went down into the Mediterranean. He woke up underwater. He fought his way out of the cockpit and floated in the open sea for hours, until a German-controlled Italian flying boat picked him up near the Isle of Capri. From there, the machinery of captivity took over. Naples, then Capua, then Rome, then north to Munich, Germany. Then the transit camp at Stalag Luft near Frankfurt, where captured airmen were first processed and interrogated. Finally, a boxcar ride east to Stalag Luft III, the camp near Sagin in what is now Zagin, Poland. Stalag Luft III held thousands of captured Allied airmen, American and British alike. Less than 6 months before Pape arrived, it had been the site of the Great Escape, 76 prisoners tunneling nearly 300 feet to freedom in a single night, through sandy soil the Germans had thought made tunneling impossible. The Germans had tightened security ever since, and by the time Pape walked through the gate, escape was no longer the goal. Survival was. For the men inside, the war was now a waiting game, governed by routine, weather, and the news that filtered in through hidden radios and rumor. The prisoners called themselves Krieges, short for Kriegsgefangener, the German word for prisoner of war. And life there had its own brutal rhythm, built around one ritual above all others. Twice a day came appel roll call. Each person had a specific spot in line, and we were not to move under any circumstances, Pape wrote. The guards would walk in front and behind to count heads. Some liked to count using their rifles. 8 in the morning, 4 in the afternoon. Rain, snow, or summer heat every single day for 20 months. Miss your spot and the count came up wrong and the whole compound stood there until it was sorted out. It was tedious. It was also a constant, unmistakable reminder of exactly what these men were. Numbers to be accounted for twice daily for as long as the war lasted. We lived appel to appel, he wrote. It was a vicious cycle. Inside the wire the men built what they could from nothing. Stoves out of empty tin cans, toothbrushes carved by hand. And to keep their minds from rotting in the monotony, they organized what the prisoners called hip pocket classes, informal lessons, taught by whoever knew something worth passing on. Pape, the farm boy from Illinois, taught agriculture and electrical engineering. Other men taught languages or mechanics or whatever skill they'd carried with them into the war. And Pape kept writing, on toilet paper in pencil, hidden inside a tin from a Red Cross box, the same kind of box that, decades later, would carry it home to his daughter. This little book should contain a few notes and diagrams that sort of describe my life and experiences since I was shot down, he wrote, quiet, almost apologetic, as if the act of recording his own life were something he had to ask permission for. 20 months passed this way. Then, in January 1945, everything changed again, and not for the better. The Soviet army was closing in from the east, driving hard toward Berlin. On the night of January 27, 1945, the order came down without warning. The camp was being evacuated, on foot, immediately. 10,000 prisoners, many of them already weakened by years of poor food and confinement, were marched out into the open, into one of the coldest winters Europe had seen in decades, stretching into a column miles long. Louis Pape and the others walked roughly 58 miles through snow and sub-zero temperatures, dragging what gear they could on makeshift sleds built from bunk boards and barrack scraps. They slept wherever they could find shelter, barns, churches, abandoned buildings, often with no food and no fire. Men who had survived combat and then survived years of captivity now faced an enemy that didn't wear a uniform, the cold itself, and their own exhaustion. Some men, too weak to continue, had to be left behind under guard. Many along that route did not survive it. The march ended at the rail hub of Spremberg, where the prisoners were packed, 52 men to a boxcar built to carry far fewer, and shipped south into Bavaria to a camp near Moosburg. 2 days and 2 nights in locked, unheated freight cars with barely room to sit. Pape described the conditions in one word, written plainly on the page: deplorable. But he also wrote about what carried the men through it. Every mile of that march, he said, was survived the same way they had survived everything else in captivity, side by side. Not as individuals enduring a private ordeal, but as a column of men who simply refused to let one another fall. On April 29, 1945, American forces reached the camp at Moosburg. Louis Pape was free. After 20 months as a prisoner, after a death march across 2 countries in the dead of winter, he had made it to the end of the war alive. What came next, he almost never spoke of, not to his children, not to his wife, not to anyone. Soon after liberation, Pape and a group of fellow former prisoners traveled to the Dachau concentration camp, where more than 41,000 people had been murdered. These were men who had just spent years as prisoners themselves, men who understood captivity, hunger, and fear better than almost anyone alive. And what they found at Dachau was something else entirely. Something that, by every account, went beyond anything they had experienced or imagined, even after everything they had already been through. His son-in-law remembers only one thing Louis ever said about that day, decades later. All he ever said was that he saw things no one should ever see. And then, like so many men of his generation, Louis Pape came home and simply got on with living. He returned to Illinois, took over the family farm, married, raised a family, worked the land through the decades that followed, lived to be 91 years old. By every outward measure, an ordinary life well lived. For nearly all of those 91 years, the diary stayed exactly where he'd put it, in a tin, inside a box, unread by anyone but him. It was a part of his life that wasn't discussed, Cheryl said. I regret not asking more questions of both my parents. After her father died, Cheryl came across a reunion newsletter from his old squadron, the kind of thing veterans' families often hold on to without quite knowing why. It mentioned something she'd never heard of before, a commemorative brick program at the National WWII Museum in New Orleans, a way for families to have a veteran's name set permanently into the museum's walkway, alongside thousands of others who served. She ordered one in her father's name. Here is the detail that makes what happened next land so hard. During his time as a prisoner, Louis Pape had been officially listed as missing in action. For a stretch of time, weeks, maybe longer, no one back home in Illinois knew whether he was alive or dead. His family had already lived through that not knowing once, decades earlier, with no way to find out the truth except to wait. So when Cheryl finally visited the museum in person and followed the directions to find her father's brick, it wasn't there, not where it was supposed to be. For a moment, decades of silence and that old, painful uncertainty collided all over again. Emotional, she walked up to the front desk. He appears to be MIA once again, she said. The staff searched the records and found it. The brick was there after all, simply misplaced in the listings. But the moment stayed with her because of what it revealed. It reminded me how easy it is for someone's story to disappear, she said, if no one keeps track of it. Today, Cheryl and David are still working through that diary, line by line, photograph by photograph, deciding what comes next, whether to keep it within the family, passed down the way Louis once passed down the farm itself, or whether to donate it to an archive so that strangers, generations from now, can read what one quiet man wrote down in pencil on the only paper a prisoner of war was ever given. Either way, each page brings something new, not just about the war itself, but about who Louis Pape actually was as a young man, 20 years old and far from Illinois, and about the silence so many men of his generation carried home with them and never set down. Multiply Louis Pape's story by the hundreds of thousands of men who came home from that war and said almost nothing about it, and the scale of what was simply never told becomes almost impossible to grasp. A pencil, a strip of toilet paper, and a young man's quiet decision in a prison camp in occupied Poland to write down what was happening to him, just in case it mattered to someone someday. That was enough to outlast 80 years, a sealed cardboard box, and a lifetime of silence. It took a chance conversation on a cruise ship, one daughter, one forgotten box, and one act of looking back, to make sure his story did not disappear the way so many others already have. As Cheryl put it herself, it belongs to the country he fought for,